Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite for you to connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media and to use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays to tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, which we'll be sure to retweet. We will begin shortly and the webinar will be shared with you afterwards via recording. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have a few housekeeping tips before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, as well as to post any questions you may have in the Q&A box. We'll be dedicating some time at the end of the conversation to respond to those questions. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook Live. A link to the recording, as well as any resources you see shared in the presentation and in the chat, will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. Lastly, before we begin, I wanted to turn your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Next Tuesday, we have a session with New America as we kick off a new series of conversations on the importance of the kindergarten year and successful transitions. On November 8th, I did want to flag we will be having a special rebroadcast session on YouTube. We encourage all of you to do your civic duty and vote on that day, and then to come back and join us for those rebroadcasts. Registration links for all of these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Sarah Torian, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. We are delighted that you could join us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, co-sponsored by Attendance Works, as we continue to lift up and explore the power and potential of public housing as a platform for reaching and engaging students and families. With this session in particular focused on the role that they can play in promoting regular on-time student attendance. Early data from a handful of states suggest that chronic absence, a challenge in many states and communities long before the pandemic, likely doubled from pre-pandemic levels during the last school year. Such a dramatic increase and the striking declines that were reported in last month's NAEP data require an all hands on deck response. With 24/7, 365 access to families, housing providers are uniquely positioned to engage students and families around attendance. So today we're going to explore just a few innovative ways that housing agencies can and are partnering with schools and families to get kids excited about learning and attending school. And to begin that conversation, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce a woman who needs no introduction with CGLR audiences, and that is Hedy Chang. Hedy is the Executive Director and President of Attendance Works, a longtime Campaign for Grade Level Reading implementation partner. Attendance Works helped to shine the light on the importance of the issue of chronic absence when most schools and districts were focusing on just average student daily attendance instead, and missing a lot of the kids that were missing many days in a school year. And Attendance Works is continuing to work as a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student attendance and closing equity gaps by addressing chronic absence and providing incredible strategic guidance and support to many communities in the Campaign for Grade Level Reading Network. So turning it over to you, Hedy, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. It is truly a pleasure to be here and to moderate this fantastic panel. So I'm going to just do a little bit of level setting. So if you go to the next slide, just because I don't want to make assumptions, I want to make sure everyone knows what we mean by chronic absence. Broadly defined, it's missing so much school that a child is academically at risk. They might not be reading at the end of third grade, poor achievement in middle school, at risk of dropping out in high school. And we've defined that, and mostly the country has adopted the definition as missing 10% or more of school. That's for missing school for any reason, excused, unexcused, suspensions. That's 2 days in the first month of school, 4 days in the second month, 6 days in the third month. It is different from truancy, which only looks at unexcused absences. or average daily attendance, which, as Sarah mentioned, both of these measures can actually mask chronic absence. Next slide. And as Sarah mentioned, we are in an attendance crisis unlike anything we've ever seen before. We were 8 million kids chronically absent before the pandemic, and now we're 16 million, 1 out of 3 kids. It's higher than ever, especially in the early elementary grades, which is a particular concern to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. We see more kids experiencing extreme levels, and the risks have actually been the greatest for kids who were in remote learning for greater amounts of time. Next slide, please. Chronic absence is really a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. And what I mean by that is chronic absence is a sign that kids are facing challenges, whether it's unstable housing, unreliable transportation, poor access to health care, bullying in the classroom, a curriculum that's not engaging them, that causes them to both miss more school, but also affects their learning while they're in school. And then the additional missed school makes it even harder for them to catch up. And given how much kids have already missed during the pandemic, we have to address chronic absence if we want to address the equity gaps that have been exacerbated during this pandemic. Next slide. And we know that the way you reduce chronic absence is you partner with kids and families to understand what are the challenges they face to getting to school, and then come up with solutions to addressing them. Whether those are the barriers in your community, the aversion they may experience because school's pushing them out maybe, or not engaging them, or even some of those misconceptions where folks don't actually recognize how much they're missing school. And what is so fabulous about this webinar today is we are bringing in our housing partners, our housing agencies, our public housing authorities who are home to so many of our low income, our kids and families who are struggling economically, who, if we don't really partner together, they face incredible challenges to being able to recover from this pandemic, which has certainly made equitable learning opportunities harder to get and really require all of us working together. So that's what we get to explore today. So next slide, please. I am so delighted to have this amazing group of panelists to join me, bringing in very different and diverse perspectives. So Maria Casey is an associate director with Attendance Works. Good morning or good afternoon, Maria. And Maria is one of our associate directors, and prior to the pandemic, she led the development of a peer learning network that was aimed at strengthening the capacity of public and affordable housing agencies to address school attendance. We're also joined by Dawn Garundo. Dawn has been a leader within the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. So those of you who have been on campaign webinars before probably have seen Dawn's face. And she has been really demonstrating what is possible at the local level, especially when you can leverage the convening, the grant making, the catalytic capacities of a local United Way. And she's been working as the Community Impact Director for the Valley of the United Way, Valley of the Sun United Way in Arizona. And then we're also going to be joined by Emily Mancini-Fitch as the Resident Services Manager for the Portland Housing Authority in Maine. Emily is responsible for supporting 13 public housing sites, which are home to over 2,500 residents. And the Portland Housing Authority is a key member of Portland Connect Ed, and an impressive and inspiring 2022 All-American Cities Award finalist, and that award was given to cities based upon their effective efforts to advance third grade reading by leveraging housing as a platform. Welcome, Emily. And last but not least, we're going to be joined by Angie Garcia-Wynn. Angie is the Deputy Executive Director of the Santa Clara Housing Authority and formerly the Chief Program Officer of the Fresno Housing Authority. Those are both places in California. For any of you who don't live in California, very different regions of California. And it is her ability to bring her experience and perspective across those multiple regions that makes her so invaluable, as well as her long-standing involvement with the local campaign, particularly in Fresno. So let's go to the next slide. Well, let me start with a question, and I'm actually going to ask Emily to start this. I want to invite each of our presenters to tell us a little bit more about the context for the work you're doing to support partnerships between housing agencies, schools, and families. So, Emily, tell us about what's the context for your work in Portland? And with that, let's go to the next slide.
Thank you, Hedy. So I'm up in Portland, Maine. For those who are not familiar, Portland is the largest city in the state of Maine, but nationally it's kind of medium-sized. It's about 67,000 residents. It's definitely the economic center of the state of Maine. It's very welcoming and supportive to new Americans. You know, Maine as a whole is always kind of lowest in terms of racial diversity, but Portland is very different than the rest of the state. It's very economically and racially diverse. Just within our Portland public schools, we have 53 different languages spoken. So a lot of different challenges that come with that work. As Hedy mentioned, we have 13 different public housing communities around the city, which it's about 1,000 public housing units. And for anyone in the housing realm, we're going through the RAD process. So a lot of that public housing is being converted, a lot of construction, families moving, and challenges there as well. We also have about 1,800 vouchers, so all in all, we're housing about 5,500 residents. And just within our subsidized housing, we have about 18% of the student population in our public schools. And just within 3 public housing family neighborhoods, we have about 9% of that entire public school population. Also, within our student population in public housing, more than 50% of our students are people of color. So what we're doing over at the Portland Housing Authority is in our resident services, we have our family support services like the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, the Resident Opportunities for Self-Sufficiency. Those are both housing and urban development programs, as well as service coordinators. We also have dedicated educational, in-house educational programming called study centers and an in-house scholarship program. And then we also have a bunch of partnerships for adult and youth programming and education, job and skill building, health services, as well as basic needs like food, household items, non-perishables. So, you know, in our out-of-school time programming, we're working on making learning fun, bridging the communication between school staff and families, and trying to increase accessibility for our families to connect with the schools.
Thank you, Emily. That's a fabulous context for your work. I do notice we have quite a few Housing Authority colleagues here joining us today. And so I think they'll resonate a lot with a lot of what you presented. Maria, would like to widen the lens and let you share a little bit about kind of the context for this work that you had done, creating a peer learning network.
Great. Next slide, please. Great. So prior to the pandemic, Attendance Works partnered with the California-based Partnership for Children and Youth, also called PCY, to establish a peer learning network comprised of housing agencies and elementary schools in about 4 areas in the Bay Area in California. The 6 housing agencies that elected to participate in this model effort are members of PCY's House Ed Network. And this 2-year effort strived to build and strengthen the capacity of housing agencies to work with targeted elementary schools to improve attendance of children living in designated affordable housing developments. Participating organizations were a mix of public and affordable housing agencies located in urban as well as some rural areas. While 2 agencies had a strong history of working together with schools, this was a new area of work for the rest of the agencies. These agencies included East Bay Asian Land Development Corporation in Oakland, Oakland Housing Authority, Eden Housing in areas called San Lorenzo in Dublin, Monterey Pines in Richmond, California, and EAH Housing in St. Helena in Napa, and also Mercy Housing in Sacramento. We held 6 group sessions over the 2 years. And again, this period began in November 2017. It ended in June of 2019. And we, in between the sessions, provided coaching and then just took them through a range of content, including why consistent regular attendance at school is important from preschool through grade 12, and how to take a team approach to improve attendance. The beauty of this program is that we were able to certainly glean from the experiences of the veterans who were a part of this effort, but it was a wonderful opportunity as well for those who were new to this work to try out new strategies that they hadn't really tried before. And again, in between those sessions, we did coaching, and it was provided by both Attendance Works and PCY. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. All right, now I want to turn to Dawn. Can you tell us a little bit about the work with the Valley of the Sun United Way and how your context and how that ends up helping you, allowing you to interact with housing agencies?
Sure. Can we go to the next slide, please? So Valley of the Sun United Way is a nonprofit partner in the community where we envision that there's a community where every child, family, individual is healthy, has a safe place to live, and an opportunity to succeed in school, life, and work. And from that, we have brought this philosophy around by hearing from our community at large to where does Valley of the Sun United Way best fit, to aligning to what is needed to truly make our community thrive. And from that, we came up with the Mighty Change. And as part of Mighty Change, we focus our areas in education, housing, health, workforce development, and grassroots organizations. It interconnects across the baseline of basic needs. And we know when we work with children and families that attendance hits that basic need. It's not always about health. It's not always about just having housing. It could be a multitude of things. So as part of our role at Valley of the Sun United Way in our education realm, we work directly with Read On Arizona. And Read On Arizona is our state literacy lead for the campaign for grade level reading. In addition to that, we lead multiple communities. We lead the convening and the conversation in the Southwest Valley of Read On Avondale and Southwest. And then we also co-lead the coalition around Read On Phoenix. What this means is it gives us an opportunity to have a voice and interconnect resources when necessary and bring things to the table that sometimes don't always seem connected, because we have the ability to look at the community at a much wider lens, both as a funder and as a lead for some of these collaboratives. So if we can go to the next slide, please. When we talk about Valley of the Sun United Way's roles, we definitely have the role of a funder. And right now, we have had opportunities in the past to work directly with Hedy's team and funded peer learning networks where we've seen drastic changes in chronic absenteeism within some of our school districts, moving from 18% chronically absent down to 11% prior to pandemic. We've seen individual schools going from 10% down to 5%, and that work just continues to lead on. Also, as a funder, we recently received ESSER 3 funding to support Read On Arizona in building a chronic absenteeism leadership team where we'll bring individuals from across the state together in this leadership team. And what they will do for an outcome is develop Arizona's chronic absenteeism resource guide. Of course, we will be doing that through Read on Arizona as they are our state lead, but we will be there hand in hand as a community, moving together in a collective impact manner. We will also help support the development of professional learning and community stakeholders through our local literacy hubs. What does that mean and how does that work? How do we work with each of those literacy hubs to ensure that we have all of the right individuals at the table, inclusive of housing, social emotional supports for our families, workforce development, all of those capacities that come together. And one I missed on the slide to share with you is we also fund what we call family stability, where we deploy individuals into our schools that have high levels of needs within our families. And we see a significant transition rate. And within that program, we have caseworkers that work one-to-one with families to making sure what is the root cause to all of the needs, but always prioritizing making sure that those children are in attendance daily and that they have planned moves should they have to transition to a new location. It is a very significant program at our United Way, and we really wrap our arms around it being a preventative measure instead of being a reactive. It is an opportunity to really listen to families and find out what the root cause, because again, it's not always one thing. It could be multiple. And then at Valley of the Sun United Way, we have the privilege of being a Read on community leader. So we lead some of those community conversations in our community. We analyze the community specific data. We look to where our pockets and our gaps are. We work directly with schools, community partners, housing, and so forth to build data-driven strategies around reducing chronic absenteeism, knowing that there is a role for everybody to play. Whether you are that school district, you're that housing program, or you are a business leader in the community, together we can make a difference.
Thank you, Dawn. What a wealth of experience you bring. Last but not least, I'm going to ask our discussant, Angie Garcia-Wynn, to just say a little bit about her background. Angie, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As Hedy mentioned during the intro, I come from many years of working at the Fresno Housing Authority. I have currently at the Santa Clara County Housing Authority, haven't been here very long, under a year, but of course, most of my experience comes from Fresno, where I did spend 12 years doing everything from being a manager of homeless assistance programs, overseeing our resident services and strategic initiatives, and then taking on executive level roles. Lastly, being the interim CEO prior to leaving. So the large spectrum there of opportunities that I had to engage with both our residents and our community and partners. And so what, really leveraging our ability to serve our residents, right? And to capitalize on some of the partnerships that we had, and then nurturing new ones. As an agency that was a very active developer, we were very intentional in putting services at the forefront and getting involved with the grade level reading campaign really helped us hone in on our focus on the children, and then also with the parent engagement component. So we saw a lot of successes there. And, it's something that we are bringing to Santa Clara County Housing Authority as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Angie. So I would love we're going to just do a quick round robin on why it is so important for housing agencies and schools to work together to help students show up to school. Whether that instruction is in person or sometimes, even quarantined, it has to be online access. So Emily, could you start, quick top level points? Why does this matter?
We're all doing so much and we can't do it alone. Housing authorities have one perspective of families and communities. Schools have, another. And info sharing is so important, bridging those different perspectives, sharing the resources, even just giving the context of, hey, this happened in the community and it's affecting about a third of the kids in this one school is it's so valuable. And it works both ways for sure.
Thank you. Dawn, what would you add?
I would add there's room for all of us. We have the ability to leverage resources. We don't know what each other has to offer unless we learn to communicate and work together as a team. Often our families may need something that we may not realize from the school's perspective. And it may be vice versa on the area from the housing perspective. Maybe they need the bus stop to change. Maybe they need a different time schedule because it's not habilitating to what works for their families and they have to cross busy roads. If we don't have those true conversations, we're not going to be able to get to the root cause of anything. So it's that true sense of building this as a community and together that we can make this change happen.
Maria, what would you add?
Oh, I just want to say that, first of all, I'm as alarmed as everyone else about the way the chronic absence rate has skyrocketed since the pandemic. And I'm especially concerned about our preschoolers and kindergartners who haven't really shown up in the numbers that they need to. And I'm thinking as well as about those third graders right now who haven't had the benefit of consistent sort of in-person learning, and for some of them, not consistent virtual learning either for the past 3 years. And here we are expecting them to be able to read at grade level now in grade 3. And so we sort of know what the outcome will be. So that's on one side, but on the other side, I see housing as just a natural partner for schools. It's a no-brainer, if you will. They share populations of students. They certainly have some of the same goals in common in terms of the students they serve and the families that these students belong to. And I think that there is so much that they can do together that they can't possibly do alone. Schools just can't do this job alone. Community partners are critical. And so we've got to find ways, and for much of the work that we've been doing around the country, we really focus on a team approach in schools. And I think inviting housing to be a natural partner in those teams is one important way that we can move this along.
Thank you. Angie, anything you want to add to this mix?
Yeah, I'd actually like to add an example of something that both Maria and Dawn shared. That Dawn mentioned something about moving a bus stop. Sometimes it is as simple as that. And for us, I can recall a time where we had we didn't know this, but because our development came kind of after the fact, and schools had already been determined, like what school every child was going to attend, we ended up having a lot of our kids. We had 2 buses that were coming to our property to do pickups. But what was happening is that the second bus was arriving to the school late. And so really it was just more of the overflow bus. But most of our kids were jumping on the second bus because it was buying them a little bit more time, right? Like to leave the house. But what we learned was that because the school was also serving breakfast, that by the time the children arrived at school, that they were missing first period. And this was just an ongoing problem at the school. And this came about in a conversation once we started engaging the school, that the kids at our property were arriving to school and late and were missing first period. So we asked what the problem was and why couldn't the 2 buses just arrive and pick up at the same time? And they said, well, there's no space. Where the pickup is, like there's no space, and where we are located, where that property was located, it was across the street from a hospital. So you can imagine that the street parking was taken up by everybody else by the time the bus pulled in. So this literally just took us knowing that was a problem, and then talking with the city and saying, look, we just need to paint a curb and we need a sign that says no parking here during these hours. And allow for 2 buses to park at the same time. And it was problem solved. Our kids were it took the parents a little bit to recognize, and we sent notices letting them know, hey, like there's only going to be one pickup time, so make sure you're at the bus stop at this time. And you know, but what it did is it helped our kids get to the school on time, still have breakfast, and not miss first period.
That is a
Little-
fabulous example, both of how if you don't talk together, you can't actually understand the consequences or the problem or the solutions. Really helpful. We are going to start getting into that issue of strategies, which I can sense our audience in the room here is really excited about. So Maria, I'm going to ask you to start by kind of giving us an overview of what are the kinds of strategies that housing agencies have used to partner with schools and families to keep families and students engaged in learning, showing up to learning. What does that look like? And by the way, I just want to give you all a heads up. Let's talk both what it looks like at the school level, but I also see some questions coming in about what does that mean for districts? So we're going to explore both school level and district level, but let's start off with the framework, Maria, that you were using in that work with PCY.
Next slide. Okay, and we can go to the next slide, of course. Okay, so a systemic and sustainable approach to reducing chronic absence requires a combination of universal and preventive programs that build a culture of attendance throughout the school and community. Early outreach that enables school and community staff to build relationships with families and allows them to address absenteeism early on. An intensive layer as well that focuses resources on the most high-need students and their families. So here in this diagram that you see, we have a tiered approach, a model, if you will, that was borrowed from the public health arena, where on the bottom end, we have prevention. And then there are opportunities here for school-led outreach and events for all students in school, and also those for housing site-led outreach and events. And then at the early intervention level, again, school-led action supporting students at risk of chronic absence and those who've tipped a bit into chronic absence, and housing site-led actions also for at-risk students. And then at the top level, intervention supporting their chronically absent students for schools and also for housing. And then let's look at the next slide. And here we don't have our pyramid, but we do still have the tiers. And we have some wonderful examples of what housing agencies can do at each of these levels and schools. And I'll just lift up a few of these. For tier 1 prevention, and again, these are activities that all students and families will participate in. Community events engaging families in academics and attendance, written and visual communications, attendance messaging campaigns, which is really critical, home visits, and a walking school bus. And on the school side, welcoming positive school climate. That's so important for children to feel welcome and for families to feel welcome as well. Hopes and dreams, conversations with families. You want to build relationships, and you do that by having positive conversations. Breakfast in the Classroom is a wonderful program. Clothes and Food Bank, family literacy programs, education workshops, clear expectations for academics and attendance. Many of these set the stage for what we call positive conditions for learning. And then in tier 2, and we might want to urge housing and schools to think about tier 2 strategies for many members of the populations who have not exhibited chronic absence yet, but early prevention really helps. So parent workshops on student success, help schools develop individual action plans. And on the other side, home visits, meeting with the family, student success plan that addresses barriers and increases engagement. And then at the third level, where we know we have just so many more students in this level than we've ever had before. But understanding that you can't case manage your way out of this. You really need partnerships at this level. So wraparound supports for families. Interagency case management is certainly a part of the picture. A direct connection to health and other services. And on the school side, again, case management is important, direct connections to services, and often you need champions who are working with children and families in this category. So a whole host of tiered strategies that are evidence-based and that we know that work. And again, one side complementing the other side. It could be that the housing side is having an event, or they're trying to craft messaging and they look to their school partners to have the kind of messaging that will make a difference for parents in terms of understanding how missing too much school is going to impact the education of their children. Or even things like showing up at a meeting in the housing establishment and telling parents about their ability to access data. Maybe the school has a portal that parents can use to see all kinds of data, including chronic absence data or attendance data. And the parents haven't been using it because they just don't know how to do it. So having a session where a part of that session is focusing on that ability to do that and enlisting a school partner to help with that is a wonderful way to complement each of those entities in terms of the roles that they play. And on the other hand, schools that have teams ought to be inviting representatives from housing development to be a part of those teams and to be looking at them with the chronic absence data and figuring out what strategies to use that would be most effective for families that find themselves in tier 2 or tier 3, and certainly those strategies that work across the board universally. Next slide, please. And so laying the foundation for change means capacity building on both sides. And what we sought to have happen with this model effort that we created along with PCY was a functioning team at the housing site, the ability to convene and conduct outreach to schools, staffing dedicated to resident and family services involved and at the helm of this actually, community and school partners represented or consulted, a commitment to developing resident leaders. Again, that resident voice is crucial, and residents in action and sort of encouraging one another is also an important part of this. And then trauma-informed PD, both on the housing side, and you see it as well on the school site capacity side. It was important before the pandemic and is so very important now with so many of our children showing up with anxiety and having experienced a high level of trauma in a multiplicity of realms at this point. And then of course on the school site side, the same thing. They need to have a functioning attendance team. They need access to real-time actionable data. They need individualized data, but they also need aggregate data so that they are seeing trends, patterns that are beginning to unfold and that they can do something about it. They act quickly enough. And then community partners, including housing, represented and consulted. A positive school climate, talked a bit about that. And then bandwidth for and prioritization of engagement of the hardest to reach families. Okay, next slide, please.
And Maria, we gotta really wrap up so we can do this one quick.
I'm complete.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
So let's come back to some of the outcomes. And I want to then shift over to Emily a little bit and hear a little bit, how did this play out over in Portland?
So in our school, out of school time programming, our goals are to build students up to be lifelong learners, increase school attendance and success, combat the effects of ACEs on childhood development, their social, emotional, and academic development, and to ensure that caregivers are equipped with the resources and skills they need to support their students. So, we focus on social emotional learning, strengthening communication channels, relationship building, and generally holistic services, trying to hit those specialized supports, early intervention, and prevention pieces. Next slide, please. So what that actually looks like in practice for us is in our out of school time programming during the school year and also over the course of the summer, we do a lot of the prevention and early intervention work. So we have the direct educational supports of homework help, tutoring, partnering on IEPs and the individualized plans for students. We do a lot of parent engagement activities and team up with the schools on those as well. So sometimes it's community meetings, inviting educators to our spaces, to our communities. Even just having the tea time in the education space for parents to connect with each other, to just have someone to talk to about what's going on in their lives and their children's lives. A lot of skill building and community building workshops, programs for youth, for caregivers, also just promoting and supporting the workshops and resources from the schools. Our schools, because we have so many different languages spoken, we have a whole multilingual, multicultural center that does interpretation and hosts all the workshops in all the different languages. And often, especially the last few years, those workshops have been offered remotely with different breakout sessions for the different languages spoken. So working with our families to try to help the technology and internet access piece for those families has been really key support for the schools to be able to engage the families, to make sure that they understand how to access their students' portals and learn about their students, their grades and everything. We also do a lot of enrichment activities, definitely trying to get at that excitement for learning, arts, STEM, sports, all of that stuff. And when educators are, really enthusiastic and partnering with us, and we know kind of what they're covering in the classroom, integrating that into the out of school time space is great for the excitement about learning. Definitely building and leveraging the individual connections to the families. That's, I think, one thing as a housing authority that is one of our strong suits. Especially in resident services, we're kind of tangential to the housing component. We're not the ones dealing with their leases. We're the ones that are there to help them. And the families know that. They connect with us. We build that kind of social work network with them. Providing the technology and internet access is something that our out of school time spaces provide for the whole community, not just for educational purposes, but to help families with other needs like job skills, resume development, even just doing their taxes. Having free Wi-Fi and computers available has been a huge asset. We also work with others on English language learning classes around computer literacy as well, to try to bridge that gap and bring people in.
Emily, did you do the computer literacy before the pandemic and it just continued, or is this new as a result of the pandemic?
We started before the pandemic with the ELL computer literacy here and there. We've done a few different workshops. Actually, during the pandemic, with the schools providing technology, whether it was tablets or laptops, Chromebooks for families, they also provided hotspots as they started to identify students who weren't connecting. And that was another area that, as a housing authority, we were able to do a lot of home visits during the pandemic. Of course, masking, distancing, all those things. But it helped us to better work with families on the technology piece to see more data across the board of people who are struggling with technology. And I think a lot of families also started to identify that, now remote learning, Zoom calls, it is the norm, and it is something that for all levels of business, jobs, you will need to have these skills. So I think a lot more people were aware of the need of the technology skills. So we did a lot of setting up hotspots, working with families, helping to ensure that those kids were showing up remotely. And for some families, even with hotspots, it wasn't working well just because we are Maine, even the most urban part is still quite rural. We even hosted some students in our program spaces so that they could access their remote classes. We would just set them up in little stations around the room so that they were far apart from each other, good airflow, to help build that connection to the classroom and to get their attendance up. So that was a great partnership with the schools in trying to build those connections. And definitely learned a lot during the pandemic across the board. You know, one thing that we were able to do before the pandemic and even during the pandemic was host parent-teacher conferences in our spaces, which really helped to have the teachers in our communities. The kids would see the teachers and say, oh, hey, you exist outside of that building. And vice versa, for us to go to the school programming, to be able to say, oh, you know, you exist outside of our neighborhood as well. I think that was a really important part of being there for each other, being present and showing that connection to the kids and families too. But yeah, we've done remote, we've done in-person parent-teacher conferences. One of our schools had 100% attendance for parent-teacher conferences, which was a huge win.
Yep.
Especially in the spring of 2021. That was a pretty trying time to engage parents and families. So really, really proud about that. In terms of some of the more specialized support pieces, Portland Housing and housing authorities all around with service coordinators, family self-sufficiency programs, and ROS programs, we have dedicated staff members in housing through these different housing grants to provide the wraparound services, the referrals, really working to build the family and financial capacity, and to do those home visits where we're another part of a social service network to support these families. So the specialized support piece is something that housing authorities across the nation are doing in different capacities, and it just makes so much sense that they work side by side with school social workers and educators to ensure that the child is eating, so that their body is fed so they can feed their mind. So yeah, more prevention work with the building enhancing community partnerships, and really focusing on just the overall surveying, data collection, data-driven work is really important to tie what you're seeing in your housing data around employment statistics or whatever it may be, into the community needs and into the grants and the work and the partnership with the schools. So.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. And there's a lot of kudos starting to come to you in the chat. So Dawn, you're now working as a role of a funder and a convener role. How does this work look like when you're attacking it from that angle?
So it was really, really exciting. So we can advance to the next slide. But one of the things we really started to look at is what did we need and how did we need to address attendance during the pandemic? And bringing together the community and community partners, we quickly learned that it wasn't the same. And we needed to really meet our families where they were at because it was very different for some. So we came up with the idea that when we put families plus schools plus community together, we would have thriving students. And we really started to mobilize our community, like, how do we better support? And, when we talk about things that happened in Read on Phoenix, they were able to support their housing with technology and to build mesh networkings to improve the delivery of internet to the families in our public housing within the Phoenix area. Out in the far Southwest Valley, while I say far Southwest Valley and it's really part of the Phoenix area, it becomes rural. And so there were other challenges. So we were able to come together as a community and get what we called community Wi-Fi's. Many of you heard of the smart buses that went out into the communities for families to be able to do their homework and things of that nature. But we had what we called community Wi-Fi's. And one was actually plugged in a church parking lot where we had the bus come and bring meals and so forth for families. And they could actually kind of all sit out there in the parking lot. We had another district use theirs in a football field where they could spread out and be safe distance. But that took the community coming together with volunteers that were comfortable to help space out the children. It took the community partners to help us fund that. It took the families to understand that it may not look the same, but what they needed to do when they got there and how to get connected with their assignments was different. And it took the schools to be flexible to understand that this may not have been a solution that would mean that children could sit there and watch live stream education all day. So it was that approach that we all had to buy into. We all had to figure out ways to come to the solution. But ultimately, in all of our work we do, when we look at the families, plus the schools, plus the community, we have thriving students. And that means that we work together. We actually brought in a group of community professionals in our area of corporate donors as a united way and said, our schools are at capacity. They're losing staff. They're still trying to serve our students hybrid models, some in the classroom, some of our children were back in quarantine. What did this look like? How do we help them? What can we do? And I can share with you, there was a multiple amount of corporate partners that raised their hand and said, we can help with IT support to leverage the services in the schools to work with direct issues, and we could help the families. Because just like Emily shared earlier, some of our families never had a Chromebook or a laptop or a Kindle. Some of our families didn't realize you had to plug in that portable Wi-Fi. They just thought it worked. So those were questions that our corporate donors, their IT teams, could triage before we were sending all the direct supports to our schools. In addition to that, what we learned really quickly is when we had a rapid amount of calls coming in at one time, we could then go to the schools and say, something's going on. We're getting flooded? And then they had the ability to go fix and make the solutions happen. So ultimately, as a funder, as a convener, it was about really listening. What did our community need? And how do we best serve them? Because there are multiple areas when we start to talk about digital inequities. And we know that when the resources weren't available, then our children just didn't show up.
And Dawn, could you give an example of how in that mix, which I totally hear, you're hearing the gaps, you're identifying the resources, you're mobilizing as quickly as possible to address the gaps and identify those. But are there particular examples of where housing and either a school or a school district were able to support either in person, let's say over the last 2 years, or but really get kids to school? Are there some housing school related examples that you were able to mobilize?
Sure, there's several different housing schools examples. One of the biggest ones is we developed what we call attendance angels. And those were the individuals within our housing community that helped ensure that our children got to the bus, or ensured that our families within our schools had the connections to the resources needed if they were being quarantined. We also had our cities step in and work and follow the routes of our school buses right up to those housing complexes to wish our kids a great day, to tell them the bus was right behind them, to build that level of excitement. But right there inside the housing complex, our students run when they see the fire truck. Well, how easy was it to make sure that they were getting on the bus then at that time? So there were ways that we engaged and used data to determine where was the locations, where were the communities that needed it most, and how did we drive and change things? And then again, made sure that there were supports in place within our housing projects. So when we ran out and brought our STEM buses, our first areas that we targeted were areas where families may not have access to the necessary tools to continue learning through the quarantine, where there were schedules where they could still come in and out and do activities and do it safely. And what did that look like and how did that work? But it was through that conversation and leveraging the use of our community with our housing to make all of these things happen.
Angie, you've now heard this whole array of approaches that Maria, Emily, and Dawn shared. Is there something that you think we should be adding into the mix of the way, the strategies that should be on the table for housing, how housing and schools work together?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I was thinking about that, you know, if I was a housing authority that was starting new and was looking at, okay, but where do we get the money? Where do we get, like, how do we provide space? And so I just wanted to mention some of the different ways that in Fresno, we had created space. It can be different ways. Sometimes it's through intentional design, right? If it's new construction, then you're very intentional about the kind of space you want to create with the design of your building, including a community room, including a lab, a computer lab. You know, these are all things that you can think about when you're creating something new. Obviously, that's kind of like the best approach, right? To get like the space that you really want. But you can also use what you have. Like there could be existing space right now and then just have it be flexible. It can be space that, you know, one day it's used as an after school program and another day it's used for a food and nutrition workshop, you know, and so forth. And then the other thing is that one of the things that we also did in some properties where we, there were some of our affordable housing properties, they weren't public housing, where we just didn't have space available, but we took units offline. And that again was a very intentional decision, right? It was, we knew that there was going to be a loss that we needed to factor in and figure out how to make it up somewhere else. But we would take a unit offline so that the space could be used in, you know, for services. So that was one thing. And then the funds, you know, sometimes it is a matter of going back and looking at, you know, where you can make some funding commitments where your board, you know, if you're a housing authority where your board can make some funding commitments. You also have some PHAs who created a nonprofit affiliate that really does a lot of fundraising specific for resident services. It also allows you to apply for grants that sometimes are closed off to public agencies. And then you also can, as you're developing new properties in your pipeline, you can be very intentional about how you fund services above the line. And so this was also something, so we kind of did all three in Fresno. And we, rather than just kind of doing the bare bones minimum of what you can dedicate to services, we were very intentional of saying, okay, $400 a door. That way we knew that there would be this like dedicated budget for resident services that was going to be slightly above what was required for, you know, the tax credit application. And you know, it probably could have even been more, it should have been more, you know, but that's where we started. And so I just wanted to make sure that I shared those opportunities because I think that sometimes, you know, we kind of get stuck with like, well, you know, HUD doesn't fund us for that. And that's true, they don't. And we can continue to advocate for it. But, you know, we sometimes have to act and then and continue to advocate for some changes in how HUD prioritize these services to our residents. And making sure that your board understands the value of that so that you can have the support to make some of those financial decisions.
Thank you. So beyond the strategies, you have to have a strategic approach commitment and look at how you make the resources available. I want to shift back to something that Dawn started raising up, which was the issue of data. And how do we use data to kind of inform and prioritize action? And I'm wondering if, Maria, you could offer some examples that you saw about how housing authorities and agencies, and particularly if there's examples involving the district self, not just a school level one, where data was used effectively.
Right. So I just want to say that we're very fortunate in California. We do have a State Department of Education that publishes data about chronic absence on a regular basis. We get it at both the district and the school level. However, it's not what we would call real-time actionable data. Really, we rely upon districts to produce more of the real-time actionable data that we find so valuable when we are deciding what strategies to use with which groups of students or with which individual students. We had one housing entity that and it was Oakland Housing Authority, had established a long-term relationship with the Oakland Unified School District. And by the way, Oakland Unified School District provides some of the best data to the public, real-time data of anywhere in the country. So they already were ahead of the game, but they were able to establish a data sharing agreement. And I won't say that that happened overnight. They indicated that they had been partnering with them for a number of years before that became a reality. And I heard the Angels mentioned, and Oakland had a number of education ambassadors that were in fact based at 7 different schools. So not only were they able to get data, but they actually had people from the housing developments working in the schools and working with the attendance teams there. So great for Oakland. And there was one other entity in Oakland, I think, that had a pretty close relationship as well. But for most of the entities that we work with, they had not really even built a relationship with school leadership. And so getting, again, those members of staff to come and at least show parents how to access the portal, it was a very important step, and helping them to build that relationship with school leadership, and also to build a relationship with district leadership. We were just getting into that. It really just takes time. So, again, it's crucial to have the data to inform what you do with that tiered strategy that we talked about, to know what students to target for those early intervention strategies, and absolutely to understand what students need to be targeted for more intensive support in that 3rd tier as well.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm going to ask Emily, but I also want to remind folks that if you have questions, please start posting them in the chat. We're going to do a little more conversation about data. Then we're also going to turn to the questions in the Q&A. So folks, please go ahead. Emily, how did you all use data? What are the ways that you're in Portland, you've used data to inform your work?
Well, the Maine Department of Education has a fantastic data portal. I think they redid it recently. It gives it's not that real time.
Yeah, it's
real time is always the best. But it does give just really excellent breakdown by school, by district, with comparisons to district averages, state averages. And that helps us to see, where are the economically disadvantaged students falling in comparison to, the other students in that same school or area. So that helps us as a housing partner with education programming to be able to draw some loose connections. We also, as all housing authorities do, have a big old database of everybody who lives, all the kids, all of the information. And because we also have a 501c3 component corporation, and we're looking for the funds and trying to find all the investments into the work that we do, a lot of grant writing means a lot of data and a lot of data informed work. So looking at the trends, the effect of the impact, like the impact of the pandemic on employment trends, household income, how many folks are relying on TANF and food supplies and things like
So
that.
Emily, you're talking a bit about both how do you use data to make the case, and also how do you use and identify where you have need. Do you ever use attendance data to evaluate what's working? Have you been able to use it in that kind of continuous improvement approach and seeing whether the strategies you've engaged in make a difference, or maybe identify a bright spot where maybe some school in some part of your housing is doing better?
So this is where we're not such a shining light, because we are struggling to be able to have that data sharing agreement a dozen years into the partnership still, which makes it very hard to look at the impact. You know, we have our own programmatic attendance trends and data, but we rely on self-reporting, what students and families can and will share in terms of their students' academic success. And that is a huge challenge for us. We are very lucky to have the Connect Ed partnership that has been working towards a broad data sharing agreement, so that providers like housing authorities and out of school time groups can have access to the systems and the reports with the consent of parents and families. You know, at this time, our focus and our data-driven work is really broad strokes, preventative, or we can kind of see this school, you know, serves this community and these are challenges that are broadly applicable, and be able to draw those loose connections there. So without that formal data sharing agreement, we're still trying to get to that point.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And it is an ongoing journey. Dawn, in your work, have you been able to use data to identify your bright spots because I think you all have had more data sharing agreements also in place. Yeah.
So yeah, our school districts have been very open to it, and our Accelerating Schools is a great example to how they used data to accelerate. So the school that we saw the greatest improvement on attendance was one that was really piloting and running with looking at individual student attendance. And from that, it became that it was actually a systems change within their district, that attendance became the priority. And then they were then aggregating the data that was being put into the state system and bringing it back out and customizing individual reports that helped to aggregate the data and look where our patterns and trends were, which also gave new ideas and ways that our district started to look at things differently, like re-engaging and having home visitations again, going back out and seeing what's going on, having that voice in the community to say, this is where we see it the most. You know, and a great example is while we had these wonderful attendance angels and they did so much work, there was so much transition and turmoil that it kind of got really quiet for a while during the pandemic. And so right now we are back at talking to housing and engaging 3 or 4 parents, and kind of going back to what was said earlier is, Angie, we give an incentive for a laundry card. If you're an attendant angel, you get in a drawing for a laundry card. It's not like it's a huge prize or a big check at the end of the day, but it's something our families needed. But again, we use the data like where we were before pandemic, where we saw the improvement, what things may have stopped or slowed down, and then what we need to do to re-engage. So we use our data consistently. And it's really interesting. Our state has just upgraded into their data system. So attendance is going to be able to be aggregated down in small increments. So we'll be able to draw it into the maps to see where that goes. But I would say the most significant gains that we've seen is the district that's really pulling their data and they're bringing it back into a Tableau system and they're dissecting it to what that district needs. Like, is it targeting which areas? Is there patterns and trends? Is there the ability that we need to go back to doing some home visitations? And my most recent interview with some administrative teams is how not only when they're targeting families or having that conversation, they're actually sharing with their families what their academic data looks like right now and how this is in relationship to the missing school. And one of the things that administration said to me, it was like a light switch. Like they could feel how different the families readjusted and focused. And then they were more apt to open up about what some of the true needs were. Like, I didn't realize my child's now getting a C and they used to have an A. But the problem is truly is I don't have a babysitter. My school, I mean, it's those things, but it was like having to be very transparent, both to the families and to the schools, and having those hard level conversations. But data is what is driving us to get some of the answers we need to be able to make the adjustments.
So there's a question, and I'm going to also open up to Angie because I think you had data sharing with Fresno also. It's from Elena Smith from the Ewing Kauffman Foundation, is wondering what are the precipitory factors that facilitated. So this is both Maria and Angie, and I may throw in a little bit here just because I was around too. Oakland Housing Authority and the district having the data. Now, I will offer up one of the things that Maria said early on, you got to keep in mind. Oakland, so I worked with Oakland before. They were the very first district that we ever helped to crunch chronic absence data and look at it. And the first time we crunched it was before their superintendent, Tony Smith, was there. And we were crunching it on the premise that we would never release it to anyone because they were scared that it would be used against them. When Tony became the superintendent, he's like, I want to release the data. Hedy, well, why don't you release it? I said, I'm not releasing it because no one in you, I promised I would never release it. We only release data with the district. And Tony believed that if you do not show your data with a shining light, then you are sort of not keeping your responsibility to equity and school outcomes. So this is, he helped to correct this data, but it was from his underlying belief that the responsibility of a district was to publicly share its data. And they had a charismatic superintendent who built that in, then codified an agreement. So it stuck even when Tony was no longer the superintendent. So just I wanted to share that. I don't think Maria was part of Attendance Works when I was going through that experience, but I'm curious, both Angie and then Maria, what are the factors that allow these kinds of data sharing agreements to exist? And Angie, I know you've seen it in other places too.
Yeah, so for us, you know, it really was, gosh, it might have been some first like talks that we had with First Five and
First Five is a 0 to 5 commission funded through a proposition in California that whatever, it's statewide funding. So just in case for all of you who don't know what First Five is.
And the executive director of First Five at the time happened to be on our board. And you know, and so our executive director had gone to one of their meetings, and so he's sitting there, and finally he asked, you know, okay, so help me understand why I should care. And he did it just really challenging, you know, like, I know that I care and I know that I should care, but why don't you tell me why I should care? And that kind of really sparked our interest about, you know, all the children that we serve and many families that we had in common. Once we just started looking, and this was even before we had a data sharing agreement, we just looked at the school boundaries, and then we looked at where we had our properties, and then we mapped out where we had all of our voucher families. And, you know, and then looked at, okay, so wow, we have like a whole lot of kids, like 19,000 kids with just Fresno Unified School District, right? So that really then told us, okay, we've got to then figure something out. And so we too got a data sharing agreement, and it took a lot of iterations of it to get one where lawyers and all that were comfortable with it. And then, you know, scrubbing the data became a whole other challenge. But we were just like, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And so we just had to stay laser focused on trying to make it work. And where, you know, we really tried to use our data, we never got to, we were getting there as I was leaving. We had started to get some parents to sign off on like household release of information where we could share data. And we were doing that with a very specific project. And then I left. So I couldn't tell you where that's at now, but prior to that, it was all in aggregate form. And it was really just to inform like the services that we were going to offer. we were already offering services. We were already offering what we called extended learning, after school programming. But rather than have it be so focused on like, let's go play volleyball, it was let's really hone in on what kind of what subject matters we should have people specialize in for extended learning opportunities. And then we'll add a little bit of volleyball at the end, right? To keep the kids engaged. But so what we learned was that, I'll take one of the schools, for example, that, science and math were like the biggest challenges. So, and that we learned through the data, the aggregate data that we were seeing for the kids that lived at our property. So then we started hosting science nights, math nights that were both for parents and the children at our properties. We also started making sure that like the staff that was doing some of the after school tutoring programs, that those were their areas of strength. And then there was also like, somebody had mentioned a parent portal earlier. We also had through data, we learned that there was only one parent that lived at our property that was actually logging into the parent portal, which is where like you can communicate with the teacher and see your child's progress, see the child's attendance. And, they just simply weren't logging in like nobody else was. So then we already had a computer lab. And so we intentionally set our parent portal hours for our computer lab so that parents knew they could come in during parent portal hours and that there would be a staff person there that would help them like navigate the system and understand what it was that they were looking for and so forth. So that right there, we could see how it jumped from like one participant to like really, we exceeded, I can't remember the exact percentage, it was over 50% like of our families that had children going to that school that logged in.
Yeah, so I appreciate there's a couple kinds of data sharing I just want to pull out that we're talking about. One is aggregate, which is confidential. And like when Maria talked about, you can go on to DataQuest, which is California's data. That's all aggregate, no individual names. And a lot of times public data, you can at least use that for kind of getting a big sense. Another kind of aggregate sharing is when you share data using a kind of a student identifier number, but you're never looking at names. And you can use that even on a more ongoing basis if you have a school district agreement. And by the way, I see the request for copies. I'm not sure we can do that during this call right now, but I'll work with Maria. We'll find out if we can get some examples of data sharing and then make sure that it's available and posted along with the outcomes of the webinar. But then the other level is consent forms where you get families, especially if you expanded learning programs, you can get families to waive off that they'll give consent and you can share data. And then Angie and Maria both talked about the notion that you can at least get parents to be able to know how to look at the data portals that they have. Any other, I want to just shift to a little bit of a question. There was a question about how do you work with districts? So why is it important to work with districts and what are strategies for working with districts, not just at the school level? And wondering if anyone might speak to that issue of district, not just school site level involvement. Go ahead, Dawn.
I'll jump in, Hedy. I think it's really important at the district level because that's where you're going to be able to make some of your systems change happen. And they're the ones that are going to be able to tell you what the capacity is that the schools have and the barriers that may be in place there as well. And one of the things I always say is a famous quote that if you're not given that seat at the table, then bring a folding chair. Ask. You can be the first one to ask too, to come to the table. You don't have to wait for your invite. I don't know, and it's interesting because it's an open door policy. So even when I started some of these convenings, there was maybe 6 of us at the very beginning. I run 62 on our monthly conversation. Come join us, bring your chair. Everybody's welcome. But sometimes I think we often hold back because we're like, we didn't get invited. We don't know if we're there. Come join us. What do you have to lose? But the ability for a little bit of time. And yet you might open the door to a whole bunch of resources that you can leverage.
I just have to say as well that if you're wanting to communicate with, collaborate with district leadership, then you need to have leadership from the housing development as well. Our resident services managers and folks who are working with the families and children on the ground are wonderful. When it comes to actually communicating and talking about what housing wants to be able to do, that they really want to partner, it really helps if your leader of your organization is also championing this and is showing up at critical meetings and is actually reaching out. And you can provide all the data and all the information and everything to fortify whatever messaging they need to do, but they need to be involved.
And you know, Maria, I'm now remembering again, back a little ways to when this started. Both you had this superintendent and the head of Oakland Housing partnering together. And it was also because the mayor convened a cabinet and a task force where she asked the head of those agencies to start talking together. So I think there's both, yes, don't be shy on bringing your folding chair and showing up. And sometimes we need our public officials to help us bring the right folks around, which can also be helpful. Go ahead, Emily, please.
That's actually what Portland Connect Ed is. So it's kind of been brought up, like the idea, I've mentioned it a couple times. Portland Connect Ed is that convening, and it was brought on by a mayor who is super invested in bringing, you know, a cross-sector collaboration to improve educational outcomes for Portland across the board. So that's where, you know, the city of Portland has kind of moved in that direction, established this organization with the support of our local United Way as well. They're a key funder and supporter of Connect Ed, and that work is all happening cross-sector with workforce development, the Portland Public Schools, city leadership. No one owns it, but everybody's invested in it, and that is the collaboration that is working to build our formal partnerships. So good.
Now, I want to go to one other question in the Q&A. And I actually, heads up, Angie, I'm wondering, because you've worked in a couple different places, you might be able to help answer this. The question is about how many housing authorities offer these programs for children and families living in their complexes? Is it widespread or not? Are ARP funds being used to start a program? You know, I mean, she did notice that Portland's a great example. But you know, how widespread is this, and what could housing authorities do to help make this happen?
Yeah, you know, I don't have the exact number, but I would say that there has been an increase of interest and participation in this kind of collaboration with the schools and focus on education for, I'm going to say, about 7-ish years. I'm trying to think back to where when we were in Fresno, the executive director, Preston, was also the president of NARO, which is, you know, a really large membership organization of many housing authorities. And so he really had pushed that as one of his initiatives and had a task force. And so a lot of PHAs had really gotten involved with, might even be longer than 7 years, but had really started learning from each other. And then I know that another membership organization, I'm not promoting any organizations, but just for resources, I know CLAFA is another one that has a lot of resources available, that they've started compiling information for housing authorities to tap into. And so there's been a lot of opportunities for us to learn from each other. I know at one point when in Fresno we had, and this kind of also answers the why work with the school district, is because sometimes there are initiatives that the school district is working on that you can be a part of. So there was a time where Fresno, San Jose, and Oakland were working with the Packard Foundation on starting Smart and Strong. So it was really focused around early learning, and every community was doing something different. And there was some funding behind that supported primarily the school district, but then there, in some way, it also supported the housing authority's role. And for us, it meant, providing a space, and it was focused on what we called informal care providers. So, there's like early learning centers, right? And then there's like the aunts and uncles and neighbors that like watch your kids while you go to work. And it was supporting them, right? In still the development of the child. And so we provided the space for them to have mommy and me, or whatever you want to call it, type of sessions and learning opportunities for that informal care provider. And then we also had like a resource library where that person could check out toys and books and that sort of thing, to help them in their efforts of working with the child while mom and dad were at work or away. So I think that this, and we learned from San Jose and Oakland through this little adventure that we went on together. So I think that those opportunities will present themselves, if you stay engaged.
All right. I know there is we have a Learning Tuesday poll, if you guys can help. Those who are sitting on while we start to finish this up, if you can take that poll, that would be fabulous. I was wondering if I could ask each one of you, if you were talking to someone who is either in a school district or in a housing authority, and they want to start this work, what would be one or two, because we're almost at the end of this, recommendations you would make for how could they start this work? Where would you begin if you want to begin to forge this partnership between housing and schools? Anyone willing to start us off? Go ahead, Emily.
Staff, dedicated, committed staff, and not just on one side or the other. I think what has made the biggest difference in our partnership is that the Housing Authority has invested in full-time education staff focusing on family cradle to career education, as well as the schools that we work best with have also invested in the dedicated full-time partnership staff, because that allows us to each bring it to the table and work towards the future and the partnership and helping the kids. Biggest asset.
I also want to comment, I noticed a Gay Cole also was weighing in, look at the data. So we can both ask our panelists here to offer your words of advice about where you would start. And if you have advice from the audience, because we know there's a wealth of knowledge in the audience, feel free to weigh in too. Anyone, Maria?
Yeah, all of the above, and again, leadership. I think it's important for district level leadership as well as school leadership, because principals can drive the message and can drive change as well. And on the housing side, you do want broad consensus that this is critically important. The partnering with schools is really going to advance not only the achievement, the thriving, if you will, of the children, but it will impact the families as well.
All right, I think we have time for one more person, and then I got to turn it back to Sarah to close us out.
I can add, I think the first part is start to build the relationships. Sometimes the conversations are tough. A lot of our schools thought average attendance was good. So you have to build the relationship and then know the data, but be a key listener, because you've got to hear where they're coming from. And, it's hard, but sometimes we're not walking in all the shoes. And that would be both at our housing authorities and our housing programs, as well as at our schools. So build our relationships, know our data, be a good listener, and figure out how we come together is how I would say we would start it.
Thank you so much, Dawn, Maria, Emily, Angie, just a wealth of information, advice, and wisdom. So thank you so much for contributing today. And over to you, Sarah.
I could listen to your conversation all day long. I love all the concrete advice, but also the high level, the bring your own folding chair, crunching the data and building those partnerships and just listening to understand what are the opportunities and what are the challenges. Many, many, many thanks to our amazing panel today, to Emily, to Dawn, to Maria, Angie. And super thanks to Hedy for bringing together this rock star panel and moderating the conversation beautifully, as she always does. And thanks to all of you who joined in with us today. I hope that you found it as informative, concrete, actionable, and inspiring as I did. And I hope you'll continue to join us for future sessions. We've got some upcoming sessions on the screen right now. Next week, we will be kicking off a monthly series in partnership with New America, exploring practices, policies, initiatives designed to strengthen the kindergarten year and the critical role that it plays in early school success for kids and families. And then we'll kick off the month of November with a special session hosted in partnership with Institute of Education Sciences, exploring some new initiatives that they are launching in response to the crisis of learning loss and to mobilize the education field to translate research into effective practice. And heads up, as Sierra mentioned at the opening, that we will be celebrating Election Day on November 8th. By continuing to support learning across the CGLR network with some high demand, timely rebroadcast sessions of previous sessions that we've hosted, and also encouraging everyone to get out to the polls and make their voices heard. I hope you can join us for these upcoming online learning conversations. And until then, have a great day, take care, and be well. Thank you all.